Bright Duty. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. Today we are looking at the chapter which is titled The Making of the Constitution. So in this chapter we will begin with the background to the framing of the Constitution. So we know the Constitution comes into effect in the year 1950. So in the background to the formation of Constitution, we will look at the developments happening in 1940s, that is the years just before the framing of the Constitution. What all historical happenings are going around in the period that is 1940s. That becomes the background. So then from there we will look at what a constitution is, what it consists of, and why is it a significant document. And the third topic which will be of focus is the meeting of the Constituent Assembly, because it is the Constituent Assembly which is responsible for the drafting of the Constitution. So the focus will be on what kind of historical developments are leading to the formation of Constituent Assembly. And from there we will look at the debates which are going around in the Constituent Assembly for making of Constitution, because as the name itself suggests, it is the assembly in which people from various walks of life, like our political leaders, social reformers, are all coming together, who are interested or given the responsibility to frame the Constitution. They are coming together, they are discussing and debating about how a constitution should be and what kind of a constitution should the Indians have. So this is an overview of the chapter, and from now we'll start and go into deep into these things which we have now touched upon. So let's begin the journey in which we will be seeing closely how the making of the Constitution happened in independent India. So as I just mentioned, in order to have an understanding, most significant is to have a broad overview of this period, especially the 1940s, which becomes the background for the making of the Constitution. So, as a student of history, it is most important to know what kind of time period and what are the social and political developments which are happening in and around the framing of the Constitution. And we know the most important development happening in the 1940s is India's achievement of independence, and it happens alongside another major historical event, that is partition. Both happen in and around the same time, and it becomes one of the significant historical development in the history of our country. And we see, as a consequence of partition, millions of refugees, the terms itself suggests, are the displaced or the dispossessed people who are uprooted and forced to move out of the motherland. So we see to India there is a migration or the coming of millions of refugees, especially from communities like the Sikhs and the Hindus. And from India, there is a movement of a lot of people belonging to the Muslim community to the newly made Pakistan. And for the Indian government, the rehabilitation, I hope you know the term rehabilitation, that is resettling or kind of giving a space or a place for these people to exist and to survive becomes a major difficulty, because the Indian government is, when the Britishers are leaving the Indian state and giving freedom to India, we are left at a very difficult position. Socially and economically, Indians are at a weaker stage. So at this point, as a result of the political developments, when the refugees are coming in, the Indian government finds it too difficult to rehabilitate these refugees. And along with this, there is another problem which the Indian government is facing, that is integration of native states. And the number of native states which are there at the wake of independence is 542. So native states, you know, are also called the princely states. So these are states which were under the direct rule of Indian kings. And there were other places which were under British rule, direct British rule, and then there were certain kingdoms where the Britishers had allowed the native kings to continue their rule. So when the Britishers left India, the Indian government, which was newly formed, which comprised of Indians, faced this new problem, that was to integrate or to bring these native states into the Indian Union. So it is said that 1/3 of the subcontinent was under the control of Maharajas, Rajas and Nawabs. So these were the terms which were used by the princes or the Indian kings, the Maharajas, Rajas and Nawabs. And when the Britishers left India, these princes thought that they could now be independent powers. They don't have to kind of come under any government because the Britishers have left. So now they are free and they could just be themselves. So for the Indian Union, this was a bigger problem. That is to convince these princely states that they should join the Union of India. And this results in a diverse condition for the government. And it is at this period that the framing of the Constitution happens. And because of it happening in such diverse conditions, we call such an effort of great courage, skill and valor, because it was not an easy time for our leaders to think about framing of a constitution, because at this point India was not only free but it was divided. There were questions or issues which were raised by the refugees. There were problems which were posed by the princely states. So amongst these difficult situations, we see that Indians decide to continue their efforts to frame a constitution. And as a result, it can definitely be called an effort which was courageous, skillful and valorous. So, as you see, this is a condition or a situation which is both exciting and confusing. We saw how this can be termed a time, that is the time before the framing of the Constitution, is both exciting and confusing time. And it is said that the period preceding the framing of the Constitution was a period of great hope. Why there is hope? There is hope because India has attained freedom from the foreign rule. But there is disappointment. Why there is disappointment? Because there is partition or the division of the country on the basis of religious sentiments. So, here even in the midst of such disappointments, there were memories. The Indians had memories of movements in which they had fought together, in which they had fought hand in hand with each other as brothers and sisters. So one of those movements was Quit India movement in 1942, in which the Indian sections or the population had come together to ask the British to leave India, that is to quit India. And at the same time, we also had this armed struggle of Subhash Chandra Bose, the great leader of Indians, the great freedom fighter. So he, with foreign aid, had made attempts to free India from the subordination. So this had also given people a lot of hope. And another important historical event was the upsurge of the ratings of the Royal Indian Navy. It is happening in 1946, just a year before India achieved independence. So ratings refer to the junior members of the Navy. So the junior members and the officers of the Navy had protested against British in this uprising. So this was also very interesting, and it gave Indians a lot of hope and the spirit to fight against the British. So along with this, another exciting thing which was happening in the 1940s is that the workers and the peasants were organizing mass protest against the British rule all throughout 1940s. So see, the background in which the framing of the Constitution is happening is both exciting and disappointing times. Disappointing because of this division of the country on the basis of religious sectarian divisions, but interesting because we see all throughout 1940s we have greater or big movements like the Quit India movement in 1942 and the Subhash Chandra Bose efforts to free India and the uprising of the Royal Indian Navy and its ratings, and most importantly the workers and peasants movement all throughout 1940s against the foreign rule. So this is what is happening in the 1940s, and as a background we can also see that as a result of these uprisings against British from different sections of Indian society, a larger degree of Hindu-Muslim unity was getting manifested, or it was giving people a hope that in the fight against British, Indians were coming together hand in hand, forgetting the religious and other kind of differences. But another disappointing thing which was happening was the two major political parties, that is Congress and Muslim League, which were significant parties who were taking decisions on behalf of Indians. They failed to reach a settlement that would ensure social harmony. Because for any country to survive, social harmony was most essential. But the two parties which were playing a major role in political decision making had failed to do anything which could favor or which would ensure social harmony. So this was a greater disappointment of these times. And beginning with great Calcutta killings of 16th August 1946, there was almost continuous rioting across northern and eastern India. Due to the failure of these parties to forge or to bring a unity among different religious communities, we saw that there were confrontations and riots and killings of people from one community by the other. So, and it was revealed most significantly in the Great Calcutta killings, which happened in the year 1946, where there was a big riot and lot of people from both Hindu and Muslim communities were killed by each other. And the violence culminated in mass killings or massacre. This term massacre refers to mass killings or when a large number of individuals or people are killed. That is what the massacre term refers to. So, because of these riots happening all throughout the year, especially in 1946 up to 47, the transfer of millions of people happened. And this is which leads to partition. Or we can say that because of this partition of the country happening, a lot of people are left displaced and dispossessed and they become refugees. And nearly 5 million Hindus and Muslims were evacuated from Punjab, Baluchistan, Northwestern Frontier Province, NWFP stands for Northwestern Frontier Province, and Sindh within few months of September to December 1947. And these dispossessed people were resettled in various parts of India. And it is said that never in human history had there been such an exodus, that is mass migration of people from their homeland to another place. So this mass exodus follows the creation of Pakistan. And as the point which we were raising was, the background to the formation of constitution happens or consists of these developments, that is partition and mass migrations, riots and killings of innocent people, displacement and dispossession of innocent people. So this is the background in which the Constituent Assembly. So now we come to the second part of the chapter, because until now we have looked at the background or what was happening in the 1940s, the time just preceding freedom struggle, the time just before India achieved independence, and the time preceding the framing of the constitution. So now we come to the other section, another section which is of significance, that is the important question, because the whole topic or the whole chapter is about constitution. So one must know what exactly does it mean when we use the term constitution. So the important question, what is constitution? So constitution states rights and duties of the country's citizens. So as you must all be knowing, this is a very simple definition of constitution which you have studied in your smaller classes also. That is, it defines or clearly sets out the rights and duties of the citizen, that is, people of a nation, what all rights they have and what are the duties of those citizens. And the government and the administration of a country function according to the basic laws laid down by the Constitution, alongside the rules and duties and the rights of citizens. The government and administration also has to run according to the basic laws which are laid down by the Constitution. The government cannot at their will do whatever they feel like. Instead, they are supposed to follow the rules and regulations which are there in the Constitution. And the Constitution lays down the structure of the government, how a government should be. So in India, we know we have a federal system of government where you have central government and the state government with a certain division of power. And it is the Constitution which lays down how the structure of the government should be and what all power should a government have. It states the powers and functions of the legislature, executive and judiciary. So we know these are the three important pillars of a democracy: legislature, executive and judiciary. And it's in the Constitution that the powers and functions of these three bodies on which the democracy stands is laid down. So, with no doubt, we can say that Constitution is the backbone of the whole structure of a country. So, it is the backbone on which our country stands. And if you fail to follow the regulations, the rules laid down in the Constitution, there will be a collapse of the whole structure. So, after looking at what Constitution is, now we come to the third topic, that is framing of the Constitution. How does it happen? This is a very difficult and very significant task which needs a lot of work, a lot of attention and hard work. And in India, a section of Indians took this responsibility and laid down one of the best constitutions for our country. So now we see closely how this journey was, what all they had to go through, and how the making of this constitution happened. In the independent India, the work of framing its constitution was entrusted to the Constituent Assembly. So, as I mentioned before, it's the Constituent Assembly that was given the task or the responsibility to frame the Constitution or to shape the Constitution. So, the Constituent Assembly was the significant body which was responsible for the framing of the Constitution. And then we look at the evolution of the idea of Constituent Assembly. So before looking at what the Constituent Assembly did, it is important to look at how this idea of Constituent Assembly is getting evolved. So we can see that it is in the year 1928 that an effort or a request is made for a Constituent Assembly, which will be then entrusted with the task of framing of the Constitution. So this demand is made by the Swarajist Party and the Nehru Committee. So both these sections, Nehru Committee, which was formed by Motilal Nehru, and the Swarajist Party, which he was part of, they are making the demand in 1928, the year 1928, for a Constituent Assembly. But the British government didn't do much on it, or they didn't take that into account. And it was only in 1934 that the INC, that is the Indian National Congress, officially adopted the demand of a Constituent Assembly. So following Swaraj's party and the Nehru Committee, the INC officially makes a request for a Constituent Assembly in the year 1934. And the same demand, that is the demand for a Constituent Assembly, is repeated in the historic statement of the Working Committee of the Congress on September 1939. So starting from 1928, the demand is raised again in 1934, and then the same demand for a Constituent Assembly is raised by the Working Committee of the Congress in the year 1939 again. But they have to meet with the same fate, that is, British government paid no heed to it, or this demand by the Indians and especially the Indian National Congress was not met. And now we see how, at which point in time is the demand of the Indians met by the British. What are the reasons which compel or force the British to meet the demand for a Constituent Assembly? So, the shock of the World War, that is World War II, made the British government realize that the Indians would not be satisfied with anything less. So, it's only during the wartime, that is the Second World War, the British realized that they'll have to meet the demands which the Indians are now making. That is the demand for a Constituent Assembly. And the demand of a Constituent Assembly was conceded or accepted in August 1940 by the British government. See, the demand which had been raised since 1928, the British government pays heed to it only around 20 years later or 15 years later, that is in August 1940. For the first time, they pay attention to this demand which the Indians are making. And the Cripps Mission of 1942 contained a concrete proposal on the part of the British government to set up a constitution making body charged with the task of framing of a new constitution. So, in 1940, for the first time, British government agrees to the demand, and as a result, or as a first step towards meeting this demand, Cripps Mission of 1942 comes up with a concrete proposal for a constitution making body, and they were given the task, this body was given the task of framing a new constitution for India immediately after the war. So we know the war goes on till the year 1945, and it's in 1942 that the Cripps Mission is coming to India and making the proposal that they will set up a constitution making body, and which will then frame a constitution immediately after the war. But the Cripps Mission's proposal were rejected by the leaders of all political parties of India. They didn't find it feasible or agreeable. The Indian leaders rejected the recommendations and the proposals which were put forward by the Cripps Mission. And it was in 1946 that Mr. Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, categorically admitted the right of the Indians to frame their own constitution. So from 42, the Indians have to wait till 1946 when the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee for the first time accepts or admits that Indians do have the right to frame their own constitution. The Constituent Assembly, which framed the present Constitution of India, was set up in 1946 under the Cabinet Mission Plan. So, the efforts which begin in the year 1928 takes such a long time to kind of fulfill itself. That is, it is in the year 1946 under Cabinet Mission Plan that the framing of the Constitution begins by setting up of this Constituent Assembly. So the most significant year as far as the Constituent Assembly is concerned is 1946. It is the year when under the Cabinet Mission Plan that a Constituent Assembly is set up, and which then results in the framing of the Constitution. Although efforts are taken in 1942 under the Cripps Mission, we saw that Indians rejected, and then later after the war in 1946, Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister of Britain, admits for the first time that Indians have the right to frame a constitution, and as a result of this acceptance by the British Prime Minister, this another mission comes to India, that is the Cabinet Mission, under which a Constituent Assembly is set up, which leads to the framing of Indian Constitution. And now we look at the making of the Constituent Assembly. Till this time, we have looked at discussions or demands which Indians are making, for a Constituent Assembly, starting from Motilal Nehru in 1928 up to 1946. These efforts are repeatedly being carried out and the demands are made, but it's only in 1946 that under Cabinet Mission Plan an effort is being taken to form a Constituent Assembly. And now we look at how this Constituent Assembly is getting formed. So according to the Cabinet Mission Plan, the elections to the Constituent Assembly were held. So for the first time, the elections are happening to the Constituent Assembly, which will decide who the members of the Constituent Assembly will be, who will then decide on how a constitution should be framed. So it is based on elections that these members are selected to the Constituent Assembly. And it had members of Central Legislature, members of Provincial Legislature, and representatives of princely states. See, people from different sections of the government is becoming part of this Constituent Assembly. That is, Central Legislature is there, members from Provincial Legislature is there, and also representatives of the princely states. They are also included in the Constituent Assembly, which then plays a major role in framing of Indian Constitution. So now we see how this Constituent Assembly evolves as a reality, and then we saw who are the members and who are getting elected into the Constituent Assembly. And now we see or look at the status of the Constituent Assembly. What kind of status the Constituent Assembly has. So the Constituent Assembly, set up in 1946, was not a sovereign body because it had been set up by a foreign government. So this is one of the biggest limitation which the Constituent Assembly had. That is, it was not a sovereign body. It didn't have an autonomy or power of itself because it functioned under a foreign government. The cabinet mission which agreed to the formation of a Constituent Assembly was set up by the British, by the foreign government. So the ultimate authority was in the hands of the foreign government. So the Constituent Assembly had no power to change the outline of the Constitution as given in the Cabinet Mission Plan. So the Cabinet Mission Plan, which comes to India in 1946 and lays down the formation of a Constituent Assembly, had already given an outline of the Constitution. And the members of the Constituent Assembly did not have any power to change it. So that way, the powers of the Constituent Assembly was very limited. And it had no real control over the constitution making of the native states and the provinces. And so, because of it being not a sovereign body, it did not have, that is, the Constituent Assembly did not have any real control over the constitution making of the native states and the provinces. And lastly, it was subject to final authority of the British Parliament. So this was the biggest limitation of the Constituent Assembly. So here we clearly get to know what the status of the Constituent Assembly was. It had very limited powers. It did not have any real power because the authority laid in the hands of the British Parliament. And the outline of the Constitution given by the Cabinet Mission Plan had to be followed. And another set of problems which the Constituent Assembly had was the attitude of the Muslim League was an internal hindrance to the working of the Constituent Assembly. Till now, we have discussed the external problems which the Constituent Assembly had. That is, British had the real power. And then we saw how the internal problems are also affecting the constituent body. That is, the attitude of the Muslim League. They are very reluctant and disappointed with the Constituent Assembly and the members of it, and they deny or kind of say no to be part of the Constituent Assembly. So this also becomes a major hindrance to the working of the Constituent Assembly. But the above mentioned limitations were soon removed by the Indian Independence Act 1947. So whatever limitations, that is both internal and external which are posed by Britain and internal which are posed mainly by the Muslim League, are to a large extent absorbed or kind of removed by this Indian Independence Act passed in the year 1947. And the internal handicap is removed with the establishment of Pakistan and its Constituent Assembly. The main internal hindrance which we just talked about was the attitude of the Muslim League, who were reluctant to be part of this Constituent Assembly. That problems that problem gets solved with the establishment of Pakistan and its Constituent Assembly. And the external problem, that is, the authority of the British Parliament, gets removed when the Indian Independence Act of 1947 is passed. So, till the elections of Union Parliament under the new Constitution in 1952, the Constituent Assembly worked in a dual capacity as a constitution-making body and a legislature. So, until 1952, the Constituent Assembly is working in dual capacities. That is, it is a constitution-making body in the first place, and it is also a legislature with certain powers. So, both these things go hand in hand until the Union Parliament election happens in the year 1952. So, now we will look at the dominant voices or the kind of debates which is happening in this body, which is responsible for the framing of the Constitution. And who all are the important personalities or the individuals who are playing a major role in framing our Constitution. So, the first session of the Constituent Assembly opened in New Delhi in December 1946. It is the year when the first session of the Constituent Assembly begins, with the temporary chairman, Dr. Sachidanand Sinha. So, Dr. Sachidanand Sinha is the first chairman, but he is posted at a temporary basis for the first session of the Constituent Assembly, which meets in the year 1946. So, this year is very important as far as the making of the Constituent Assembly is concerned, because the first session of the Constituent Assembly takes place in 1946. And as we already mentioned, the representatives of the Muslim League remained absent. In the Constituent Assembly, efforts were made to bring members from different sections of the society. We saw how members from the princely states were included, and central and provincial legislatures were included. But the representatives of the Muslim League denied or remained absent. And on 11th December 1946, the Constituent Assembly elected Dr. Rajendra Prasad as its permanent chairman. So, from Sachidanand Sinha, we see that in the same year, another permanent president gets elected, that is Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who plays a major role in independent India. And we have other prominent members in the Constituent Assembly like Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, M.K. Munshi, Acharya Kriplani, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, and many others. So, these are just few names which you could remember as far as the members of the Constituent Assembly are concerned. But obviously, there are many others who are members of this assembly. And the Anglo-Indians were represented by Frank Anthony, and the Parsis were represented by H.P. Modi. These were the two people who were representatives of these minority sections in the Constituent Assembly. And women were represented by Sarojini Naidu, Vijayalakshmi Pandit and Durgabai Deshmukh. And there were several other women, but some of the important or significant personalities were Sarojini Naidu, Vijayalakshmi Pandit and Durgabai Deshmukh. So, thus it is clear that Constituent Assembly represented all the classes of the country. After the partition, the Constituent Assembly was left with 308 members or 308 members. So, the Constituent Assembly to a large extent tried to bring representatives from different sections of the society. We have representatives from Parsis, we have representatives from the Anglo-Indians, the women and the minority communities. So a special effort is made to have members from these different communities. And after partition, there were around 308 members in the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly of India was the sole constitutional authority for the Union as well as for the states. So, post-independence, we see that the Constituent Assembly was the sole constitutional authority. It had the power to frame and to lay down rules and regulations both for the Union as well as the state. That is, both for the central government as well as the state government. It was the Constituent Assembly that laid down the rules and regulations as it was responsible for the framing of the Constitution.